Back on MorningLine, thanks for joining us. Nick Barris here with Clint Kelly, malpractice attorney here in town. Wanted to ask Clint, and I don't know if I asked you this last time you were on. Since then, I believe we had Davidson County District Attorney Glenn Funk on. In one case you and I talked quite a bit about was Redonda Vaught, the nurse who was found guilty at Vanderbilt, and you know, a big uproar over whether or not she should have been charged criminally, which she was ultimately. She and other nurses and some of the people close to her are getting with state lawmakers to see about trying to pass a law that would give nurses qualified immunity, meaning that they would not be able, except in maybe extreme circumstances, it's not been written yet, but that's what they're seeking, that nurses would not be able to be held criminally responsible for mistakes made on the job. Glenn Funk said didn't think it was a good idea for a lot of reasons. What do you think, as someone who kind of falls in the middle, sees both sides of this, the idea of qualified immunity for nurses not to be charged criminally? Doesn't mean they're immune from maybe being sued civilly, but criminally.
Okay. Bad cases make for bad law. Yeah. We've known this in the legal profession for years. So you take a case that's bad on the facts, and then you try to cure it with a law that makes the situation worse. It's what we call unintended consequences. So you give a nurse qualified immunity from prosecution, and then the courts have to interpret that qualified immunity when you get a nurse that's involved in a situation where you have like an angel of death situation, okay? And that nurse wants to invoke the qualified immunity. You say, well, you can make the qualified immunity disappear if there's intent, but then the question becomes, is it recklessness or intent? I don't think that's right. I don't think, in my judgment, a nurse deserves any more protection than a doctor, okay? Or a pilot, or anyone else who has immediate control over the safety of others. Why shouldn't truck drivers have that type of protection? You get my point?
Yes,
I understand the frustration with Nurse Vaught. I agree with it in many respects. I've told you, I don't think you're going to see any more prosecutions like this.
I hear you.
Because of the beating that our district attorney took over this. And because of that, I don't think this law is necessary. And I think the unintended consequences of the law could be worse than simply leaving the situation as it is. I appreciate nurses. They are great workers. They're underpaid and they're overworked. But when you start giving special laws to a class of people to address what is perceived to be an injustice, then you're saying two things. First of all, they're better than other people. And secondly, you're saying, you know what? You as a nurse now have a special get out of jail free card if one of your other brethren decides to be more aggressive and kill somebody.
Yeah.
I don't like that law.
You know, I was kind of playing around with it in my head, and I'll talk more with Vaught and others behind it, but that, I cannot disagree with you at all on that. I think you're right on point. Isn't that also what the legal system's in place for, so that by passing a qualified immunity law, it takes it out of the hands of a DA, judges, and a jury, which will decide. I mean, it's not as though the criminal charge being brought means they're automatically going to be found guilty, right? I mean, I agree with you. It's going to be very rare that these come up, but we have a system of justice so that you don't have to have laws like this. You can let juries decide.
Right. I mean, I don't know of any other case like Nurse Vaught's case. I'm sure we could do research and maybe find one, but there's certainly none that's been public. It's such a rare situation. In other words, I think it's the exception that proves the rule, which is these cases aren't brought criminally. And they're not going to be brought criminally because of what happened in this situation. The laws of unintended consequences. Once you start passing laws like this, I'm telling you, someone is going to be a victim, and they're going to be a victim to that new law simply because we rushed to change laws because we were unhappy with prosecution. I don't think that's the way laws ought to be passed. And by the way, I still trust jurors. I still trust jurors to make right decisions in these cases, which is why, you know, it is what it is. But I just don't think you're going to see any more of these prosecutions.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't.
Look what the judge didn't give her any time.
Nope, she's not doing any time. Exactly, and I think that was the right move by the judge. One part that did come out of it, and I still hear from people asking questions about this. Okay, we know what Vaught's involvement is, but a lot of folks are worried about what Vanderbilt's role may or may not have been, and hospitals in general, where you hear about how sometimes, you know, nurses and doctors have to take steps to bypass things to get stuff, and you know, what about that issue for folks thinking about going to the hospital and wondering, you know, is the system set up for nurses to fail? I mean, you know, we know in the Vaught case there were questions and she had to bypass certain things. Now, the DA argued that she was way over the top in how much she bypassed. But sometimes, you know, delivery of, what's it called again, the way you order up the drug, you know, like in the Vought case. You know, remember, she has to order it up and has to bypass certain things because the system was down, and doctors sometimes have to do an end run. Is what I'm saying is that her defense attorney basically argued it's not just the nurse here, it's the system that is a concern that we need to address and make sure this doesn't happen.
Correct. And I mean, it was a system failure. I told you, I think that's what made the public so angry about this was Vanderbilt. They just wrote a check and got a clean pass, whereas this lady had her personal liberty at stake. And Vanderbilt just kicked her to the curb. That's certainly what it looked like to everybody else. You want to change a law that I think would benefit the nurses and the community, pass corporate liability for hospitals. In other words, if something happens on the nurses, something happens by a nurse on the hospital's watch, then the hospital's automatically liable for that. They're liable for any system failures, and they have to provide any legal assistance to the nurse to defend themselves if they're brought into the case. In other words, the hospital becomes the central focus of it, and the nurse is basically an appendage to the case, but the nurse is protected. They get full protection by the law and full protection for attorney services if they need it. We call that corporate liability or the corporate doctrine. Medicine now has become delivery by corporate entities. That's what all these places are. Even the nonprofits like Vanderbilt, they're making money. So just like we have corporations that are liable for what their employees do, why aren't hospitals liable to the same extent? I mean, we have what we call agency, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but there is such a thing as agency where a hospital can be liable for a nurse, but all these nurses nowadays in hospitals, a lot of them have independent contractor agreements, particularly in the emergency room. They work for, the work is contracted out to smaller companies. Well, the hospitals, when you sue them, they just say, hey, we didn't have an employment relationship with this nurse. We just contracted out, like they're independent contractors. So the hospital walks away. You put the nurse and the intermediate company in the crosshairs. I don't think that's right.
It kind of gives the hospital cover, doesn't it? I mean, they maybe intentionally choose to do that.
When you get sick and I get sick, we're not going to the hospital because of some independent contractor arrangement or some little company out of Texas we don't know about. We're going to the hospital because of the hospital's name, their reputation, their delivery of medical services, right? You're going to Centennial because it's TriStar. You're not going to Centennial because you think this nurse is employed by some company or this ER doctor is employed by some company out of state.
We don't think about that. So I'm trusting, Clint, that if I'm going there, regardless of where they get their employees for, because it's this hospital, that reputation, that they vetted it, and whoever I'm going to be dealing with is going to be up to the standards I expect. But you're saying that's not necessarily the case, or if it turns out not to be the case, the hospital doesn't have to stand behind them because it's coming from an independent contractor.
That's correct, and one of the biggest misunderstandings, if you will, by the public. People think that, or because they're told this by the hospitals, the doctors and the nurses are exercising independent clinical judgment. It's always their responsibility for what happens. What people don't understand is every hospital has rules and policies and procedures and training. These nurses and these doctors go through this training to help them deliver services in accordance to what the hospital wants them to provide. In other words, the hospital's a partner in this. But when they get sued, they say, hey, we didn't have anything to do with this. This was all independent clinical judgment. You see my point?
Why is it that way?
Because they don't want to be held liable for it.
I know, and how is it? I mean, I'm just thinking, like, for instance, in the media business, if a reporter makes a mistake to some degree and we're sued for libel or something along those lines, the media corporations that owns us, the legal defense, it's not the reporters kicked to the curb and said, well, you showed the wrong person's picture and you're getting sued, see you later, you got to handle that. The media company, you know, backs you up and provide, I mean, and I think other companies, I don't understand why it's different for hospitals.
Nick, I'm stunned until this day that local news organizations, Channel 5 for instance, have not gone in and investigated Vanderbilt's role in this situation with Nurse Vaught, the system failures, and ask the question for the public, was she set up to fail as her defense presented to the jury? And if she was, why? Because if the public really knew how much Vanderbilt is involved in processes and protocols and policies in terms of care being delivered, I think they would be stunned to realize it's not just nurses, it's not just doctors, it's hospitals that are a full partner in the delivery of health care. And so when it fails, they're a partner in the failure as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's what most people would assume, but it's not the way it plays out.
It had been done, but I think it should be done at some point.
We'll take a break on that note when we come back. Final segment with Clint Kelly right after this. Stay with us.